Hi, everyone. I'm Lynya Floyd, an award-winning journalist and one of the co-hosts of the Scarlet Society podcast. Today, I'm inviting you to put a crown on your head, settle into your throne, and become a boundary-setting queen. This episode is for every woman who ever wondered why no never seemed to work as a complete sentence for her, why people pleasing is leading to exhaustion, and why she can't stop worrying about what other people will think if she doesn't say yes to taking on more work at her job, driving an extra shift for the carpool, cooking dinner tonight again, and well, you get the picture here. On today's show, we have Wendy Sterling, a certified divorce specialist, grief consultant, and boundary setting expert who has helped thousands of women across the country. After ending her own 16-year marriage, Wendy saw firsthand the lack of support divorced women experience in moving through pain, fear, and anger to experience joy, self worth, and freedom again. She channeled her energy into building a wildly successful business in just 2 years that helps women heal their wounds and their victim mindset and reclaim their identity. Wendy's expertise has been featured in more than 100 media outlets, and she is also the host of her own podcast, The Divorced Woman's Guide. When she's not showing her clients how to turn the most painful moment of their lives into the most empowered moment of their lives, you can find Wendy spending quality time with her two teen boys in Los Angeles, California. Wendy and I had an electric conversation about how to figure out what your boundaries even are. We also talked about times in life when your boundaries are the weakest and how to strengthen them. And Wendy served up some one-line scripts that will help you maintain your boundaries even when you feel like they're crumbling. Listen up and never have your boundaries bulldozed again. So, Wendy, I am absolutely thrilled to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for being here with us today, talking all about boundaries.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm so excited to be here.
This is going to be a great discussion because boundaries are something that everybody could use a little bit more of, I feel like. But let's first start at the very beginning and talk about why they're so important. What is the big deal about boundaries? Why should we care?
That is a great question because I had no idea what the answer was, even just 5 years ago. Boundaries are really important because they tell you and other people where you end and somebody else
Mm.
begins. And if anybody out there is like me, I was very confused about what that looked like. And what boundaries are intended to be are rules, guidelines, limitations that you create so that other people know what is safe, permissible ways that they get to interact with you. And so many of us think that we have boundaries in place, but in fact, you may, but you're not communicating them in a way that is either being heard or respected. So it's really important that you understand the difference between a healthy versus unhealthy, loose versus rigid boundary.
I love what you just said there because people might have boundaries in their minds, but unless you're communicating them, it doesn't count, is basically what you're saying. And I don't think I can't
Yes.
remember the last time someone really clearly communicated their boundaries with me. So that says something.
Yeah. And so many of us, and even with so many people that I talk to, they're like, oh, yeah, I totally have boundaries. And I'll ask for an example. And, what I end up hearing is that, well, you tried to set one, but then you got bulldozed by the other person and you compromised. And I'm not saying that there isn't compromise involved in, you know, engagements with other people in communication. But what I care about is you feeling confident that the boundary that you're still compromising on still aligns for what feels right for you. And so many of us, that's not the case. What ends up happening is that they actually are they're not fully honoring themselves when they are in that negotiating process. And so what I hope your listeners get from our conversation today is understanding what it means to really communicate, be heard, and feel respected when you are communicating those boundaries, and doing so from a place of power. Because what I know to be true is that when we have our boundaries clear and clearly communicated, it actually creates stronger relationships with the people in your life. Whereas we think that it's actually going to push people away, which is something that a lot of people make the mistake of.
Yeah, I think I fall into that category. I'm sure a lot of the other Scarlet Society women who are listening fall into that
Yes.
category. We think that having those distinct boundaries is going to break things down, and we fall into that people pleasing mode and we let our boundaries down. When in reality,
Exactly.
you're saying it's the opposite. So tell me
Exactly.
something about why a lot of the times this is a struggle for women in particular. Why do women have such difficulty creating firm boundaries?
Well, number one, you just said it. We tend to be people pleasers, and we really, really strive to make other people happy before we really check in and wonder, does that make us happy too? And so, what ends up happening is that we put other people ahead of ourselves, and that is where we lose sight of what is important to
Mm,
us. And the way in which we understand what is important to us is by clearly identifying what your values are. Because what I've learned over the last couple of years of becoming that boundary setting queen that I
whew.
am is that my boundaries are derived from my values. So, what is super important to me in my life? And how do I align my decisions, my choices, my words with those values? And so, when I am engaging with other people and I feel like my boundaries are being stomped on, what I do a check in with are, wait a second, is this because my boundaries are not being honored? So, how do I make sure that in setting these boundaries with this person, or whether that be a colleague, a spouse, a child, a family member, a friend, it's getting back in touch with your values,
Mm.
right? Like, what makes you tick? What is your north compass? Because many times we struggle with that slowdown, being present with our thoughts, to then understand, wait a second, am I doing this for them, or is am I still being fulfilled during this decision, or with this decision that I'm making?
Now, I love that we're talking about values. I don't think that that's something that people think about very often. So I would love for you to share with our listeners what are some of your core values? What are some core values that your clients have
Yeah.
expressed to you so that they can just kind of get their juices flowing, thinking about what their values are?
Yeah. So values are things like, for me, my top two values are integrity and respect. Other values can be connection, fun, friendship, communication. My clients, especially the ones that I work with, respect, honesty, connection, love tend to be the higher
Mm,
priority values that they
mhm.
have. And so a lot of times our values are, they're resonant within us. Like, you have a physical reaction when you think about, gosh, I love being around people that are in integrity, right? Like, that makes me feel really good. Like, I feel like I shine when I'm around people who are in integrity, because I know that when people are not in integrity, right? Or when I feel like people are being dishonest with me, I have a physical reaction and I need to remove myself,
Mm,
for example. So, boundaries that I set when I'm around people that don't honor my value of integrity is, I will either stop being friends with
mhm.
them, or I will remove myself from a situation. With regards with respect, it's the same thing. It's communicating my boundary. I do not appreciate the language that I'm hearing. It hurts my feelings and I feel disrespected. And so that's how I communicate, for example, when my boundary of respect, or excuse me, my value of respect is not being honored. That's how I communicate what my boundary is, by naming it and removing myself, or letting the other person know, like, hey, this doesn't work for me, that I am not okay with how I am being spoken to. and naming what the consequence is. Now, a consequence isn't a punishment. What a consequence is you letting the other person know that you're not going to sit there and take on, this
Mm,
disrespect, right? You're not going to sit there and be the recipient when you don't deserve
mm,
that. No one deserves to be disrespected. And so instead of seeing a consequence as a punishment, it's simply an action. It is an action that you take when you are out of alignment with your values. And so for me, respect is a really, really big one, and one that you can come up with language in the I am, I feel, instead of pointing the finger at you disrespected me, because the other person then shuts down. They're not going to hear you. But for you instead to say, I don't feel respected or I feel disrespected. And so I'm going to remove myself or I'm going to hang up the phone
mm.
if I continue to feel this way. Right. So it's really about being able to communicate openly with people in your life from a place of, this doesn't feel good. This has to do with me. This has nothing to do with you. And that's how you deepen the intimacy of the relationships that you have in your life, right? Like it takes vulnerability. It takes vulnerability to create that intimacy with somebody. And many times when somebody hears that that you're making someone feel a certain way, you go, "Oh gosh, that was not my intention." And it just also opens the door for more communication. So it's super, super important that people get in tune with what their values are so that they know how to communicate. Because if you don't, what ends up happening is what I did when I was
Mm.
married, which was I became this volcano and I would just explode and I would yell and I wouldn't be heard. Versus, when I slowed down and I went, okay, what value is not being honored in this moment right now? Then I could communicate, okay, I feel disrespected or I feel like I'm being lied to right now. And then that opens the door for conversation instead of you feeling like you can't open up or you're going to quote unquote react instead of respond.
So I love that you brought up the I versus I feel language versus the you are or you make this or you always. I think those subtle shifts in language are so extraordinarily powerful. And I know that's some of
Yeah.
the teaching that you do with the clients that you work with. I would love
Yeah.
for you to share a moment that you realized that you didn't have strong boundaries around you and what you decided to do about that.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, the story is the night that I discovered that my ex-husband was having an affair.
Mm,
And it was the night where I got punched in the gut to a place where I woke up to realizing that I didn't know where I ended and he began. I had no idea who I was. I had no idea how I had gotten to where I was in my life. And it was, it was that moment that you hope, right? You want to be wrong, but yet you know deep down that you're not. And part of wanting to be wrong is you not wanting to face, right? Who you are, what you've allowed to occur in your life. And I think that, in that moment, what was so eye opening for me was that I didn't know. Like, I remember there was this moment after I caught him and I confronted him that I looked in the mirror
mm,
and I had no idea who was staring back at
mm.
me because my identity was so closely tied to him. And I didn't know where I ended and he began until that moment when I realized I didn't even know where that line
Mhm,
was in the
mhm,
sand. And so in that moment, I remember I said, I was like, no more. This is not going to happen anymore. And the way that I know that I really recognized and committed to creating boundaries with him and then, ripple effect with other people in my life was using my voice in communicating my feelings about actions or decisions or ways in which I was being communicated with. And I'll never forget a couple of days later, when he was coming to grab our kids, he pulled onto my driveway and I felt this like
mm,
energy of negativity. And it was the first time I opened my mouth with a boundary to him. And I said to him, I said, I do not feel comfortable having you drive on my property. Please wait at the curb.
mm.
and the boys will walk down the
That is
driveway.
that is a geographic
And
boundary. Yes.
it is a geographic boundary, and our most common boundaries are ones that we create around our time, our energy, and our space. And so for me in that moment, it was the first time that I had really come to a place where I was like, you know what? I get to have what I want. I get to create what feels best for me. And in this moment, being around him was not an option. And I didn't want him on my property. Granted, it was our house as a family, but I didn't want him there, and I didn't want to see him pull up. And so for me, just even saying, I don't feel comfortable with you driving on the driveway, please wait on along the street,
Yeah.
was, I mean, I remember I like, it was one of those moments where I was like, did I really just communicate that? Did I really just, did that just come out of my mouth? Right? You're like, wait, did I speak? And I did. And he listened. And it was such a powerful moment for me. One that I remember, like, I mean, this happened, you guys, almost 6 years or 5.5 years
Mm.
ago. And almost 6 years ago. Yeah, 5.5, 6 years ago. And to this day, it was such a powerful moment because I finally feel seen and heard.
Mm.
That was such an issue for me. And no matter how, how loud I was, the sternness of my tone, that never worked, but this did.
Mm.
And it was so powerful. And I will tell you and your listeners, I have not turned my back to creating language that works for me, for the people in my life, that set boundaries, that allow me to feel in resonance, right? To feel authentic, to feel like myself with all relationships
Yes.
and with all people in my life.
Yes. I love that. That is so beautiful, right? Having nice, clear, calm, firm boundaries, better than yelling, better than cursing, better than turning into a volcano, right? And exploding, and
Exactly.
easier and more gratifying and more immediate in terms of the return on that emotional investment. I love that. All right, so tell
Exactly.
us a little bit more about how go into your divorce, how you became a divorce coach, and why boundary work is so not only tied to the transitional phase of going through a divorce, but any kind of really difficult transitional phase that someone might be going through in life. Why is boundary work so important for a lot of those phases, which can come in your 40s and beyond, like a lot of our listeners?
Yeah, and I'll also tell you, I have I have certainly used my boundary work in different relationships in my life, and especially recently around my grief.
Mm.
I know but my mom passed away in January, and there's a lot of, it's a whole other podcast episode,
Mm.
but but what that also taught me was creating boundaries with family members in my life. So I'm going to answer this, kind of across the grief spectrum as well, which perhaps some of your listeners have also experienced, because, grief is something else that I do coach around. But the reason that I became a divorce coach was because of my experience. I knew I wanted to do something. Um, I knew I wanted to do something helping people. I wanted to work with people. And I had been in corporate for 20 years, and I was in ad sales, and I was leading teams. I was building these multi-million-dollar regions. But what I truly loved was really supporting my team members and inspiring them to become like the best, you know, role that the person in that role that they could become. And so when my divorce happened, my separation really, I knew that there had to be a reason that this was happening for
Mm.
me. I was tired of being in my victim mindset of like, how did this happen to me? Why me? Am I not lovable? It got really old really fast. And so what I really empowered myself to do was to see the silver linings in my divorce. And for me, it wasn't like a one stop shop where it was like, oh, yeah, life coaching, done. No, there were all these different elements to my healing process that helped. And I know helps my ideal client because there isn't just one thing, you guys. Like I was in therapy, then I added in life
Mm.
coaching. I added in, Reiki. I took spiritual psychology courses here I live in LA, down in Santa Monica. I studied to become a theta healer. I'm also a sound bowl healer, like all these different elements, right? because there wasn't just one thing. And so for me, it was really important for me to get my energy back to where I could pick myself up. I mean, there were days where just getting out of bed and getting my
Mm,
kids to
yeah.
school was really hard. And I knew that if I was able to overcome the unexpectedness and the trauma of my divorce in a year, that I could accelerate this for my clients because I brought everything together. And at the foundation of what I learned was that boundaries were the number one thing that no one taught me growing up. I didn't have any in my marriage. I didn't have any with my kids. I didn't have any with my parents. That's now playing out in my grief around my mom passing with my dad. And so I'm at this place where I'm like, okay, not only do I need to figure out who I am, right? What my values are and who I am without, the definition of this man in my life or my family, but I also need to know like what is permissible, what is acceptable, what will I tolerate, what won't I tolerate? And that just it opened my eyes to be able to go, "Oh, wait a second. I don't have to listen to my ego that's like, oh, you don't want to upset them, or
Mm,
oh, this is what's expected of you, Wendy, or, oh, that is not the way we've done
mm,
things, right? And so you have these inner voices in your head. And so what I got to learn and teach myself and also through my coaches was to really understand like what it meant to listen to myself, to really put those boundaries up to be able to go, wait a second, just because that's what they need doesn't mean that it feels right for me. And so when we're going through these transitional phases, what I always say is that it is a blank canvas. It is an opportunity for you to hit the reset
mm.
button, not just on your own life, but also in your relationships with people. And so many times we don't give ourselves that permission. Now, I also want to say, don't use a transitional phase as an excuse. Start today. It doesn't matter if you're going through a transition or not. Everybody, any given time, can start setting boundaries with
Mm.
people. And it doesn't matter. I hear this all the time. Well, but if I do that, I haven't been doing that. It's just easier. I hear all these mistakes all the time. And I'm here to tell you, it may not work the first time like it did with me telling my ex-husband to stop driving on my driveway. Sometimes or more times than not, it takes repetition. However, it's never too late. You can always rewrite boundaries in relationships with people in your life. And it's always an option. Just choose it. Stop choosing what you've always done because let me ask you a question. How's it going?
Yeah.
How's it working out for you?
Yeah.
Because 9 times out of 10, most of the women I talk to, they're like, "Oh yeah, it's not really working out because when I say yes to this, then I can't do this." And we live by to-do lists and it's like, "But I said yes to them." So why are you putting other people ahead of you? Why are you making other people a priority? That's the question I would ask yourself.
I
Why do other people get to come first?
I love that you are reminding all of our brilliant listeners that they should not be at the bottom of their to-do list. And that is a
Yes.
struggle for us as women so often. So I totally get it. But having that reminder is so wonderful. I also loved the way that you were talking about how outside forces can kind of weaken or make our boundaries vulnerable, right? Going through a
Yes.
transitional phase, going through grief, going through something really difficult. Can you say more about how we internally weaken our own boundaries? And very often in ways that we don't even realize that we're doing it, but what are some ways that we do that?
Oh yes, and we're all guilty of this. And I am so guilty of having done these things and sometimes I fall back into it too. You guys, we're humans, we're not perfect. However, what I know to weaken our boundaries, the number one mistake that we make is oversharing, explaining. So when somebody asks you, "Hey, can you like for example, my ex has done this and I used to just always give in and now I don't, but it'll be like, "Hey, can we just switch days?" or like, "Hey, can the kids stay with you just like a little bit longer?" And you go, "Well, that I don't think that's going to work for me because I've got this and the da da da." And what ends up happening is you open yourself up for negotiation instead of, no, that doesn't work for me. Stop there. And so many times the reason we go into explanation is because guilt sets in. Oh, well, they'll understand. Like, I feel really bad. How many of you apologize? Oh, I'm sorry. I
Ah,
can't.
yes.
Don't apologize. You owe nobody an apology. Unfortunately, that doesn't work for me. Or nope, that just doesn't work today. No is the easiest yet hardest boundary that all your listeners can start using and practicing, right? We open ourselves up for dialogue, and then what happens? You totally lose course and you get sucked back into wanting to people please. Oh no, I'm disappointing somebody. Oh, I have mom guilt. Whatever it is, you're opening yourself back up. You do not owe anybody an explanation around the word no.
Yeah.
Another thing is when we don't use our voice, right? The opposite, right? Instead of just like, stream of consciousness, you're just not responding. Silence is an answer. Yes, it is. However, if you are staying silent when somebody is requesting something that doesn't feel good to you, more times than not, you wind up just saying yes and you cave in. So who does that serve? Them or you? Another mistake that I hear people make, right, where we weaken our boundaries is we will start going into the place of the other, or perhaps the other person will go there, which is bringing your kids in. For those of you who have children, I hear this so many times where, one person will start bringing the kids in, or you bring the kids in your mind going, oh, if the kids find out I did this, or, oh, I don't want to upset the apple cart. Like, I don't want to upset our kids. So many times we weaken our boundaries because we're afraid of what our children are going to think, right? Especially when you're going through divorce, you already have guilt about breaking up your family, and you know that your kids are having their own experience and you feel responsible for their experience. But at the end of the day, what I have learned, right, in my own experience, I have two boys, and setting boundaries with them has been one of the greatest lessons of my divorce. And holding space that they get to have their experience, and me caving in on my values and caving in on what feels good to me isn't going to help them. It's actually going to hurt them, because then what happens? They get depleted mom. They get angry mom. And so you're not putting your best version of yourself out there for your kids when you're not honoring, or you're weakening your boundary. And this might seem bold for some of your listeners, but when you don't honor your boundary, you're just allowing yourself to become a doormat. And I say that language because, like, it hurts, it stings. And I used to be a doormat. No more. I will not tolerate it anymore. I did that for 4 decades, and I'm not going to do it anymore. I just won't. And the same comes into play. Like, I'm having to learn, even now through grief, like teaching my dad, stop grieving on me. You get to grieve. Grieving on me is not going to work, because I have my own grief. So I've started setting boundaries with my dad around his grief. Right. And so this applies to anybody, whatever the transition is that any of your listeners are going to. Like, if you're going through, excuse me, and if it's a breakup with a boyfriend, stop answering text messages. That's another boundary. Like, you think that you're writing to them and saying, stop, stop, stop. Well, the response is they're like, ooh, I got them.
Yeah.
Ooh, I got them. I still have them.
Yes. You are absolutely
Delete,
right.
block, delete.
That is an easy boundary, right? Delete, block. That's an easy boundary.
Yes.
I love you breaking down how we weaken boundaries. I would love for you to say more about strengthening them. You talked a little about that earlier. In a sense, right? Practice makes perfect. Keep at it. There's so many things that we don't get perfect the first time or the second time. You have to practice, right? So keep practicing those boundaries. What else can we do to strengthen our boundaries and make them absolutely rock solid, impenetrable?
Yes. And it's so much easier than your listeners think. So The first thing is going to go against what you've probably been doing this whole time. So I'm inviting you all to retrain your
Mm.
minds. And instead of going into immediate reaction mode, I'm going to invite you to do something that I call pausing. There is power in your pause. We live in a world of instant gratification. Gotta love our phones, and we have a love-hate relationship with our phones, right? Because we have grown into a society where there is an expectation of immediacy because we're all connected and we feel like we always have to give an immediate reply. No, you do not. You get to take that in and go, how does this make me feel? Right? It's almost like practicing mindfulness when you're setting
Oh,
boundaries,
nice.
right? Is like taking a minute and pausing and going, okay, how do I really feel about this? Not what does my people pleasing ego self want? How do I feel with this? Check in with your values. Does this honor me? And really think like, do I have time for this? Is this something that I can give 100% of myself to? Does this feel 100% in alignment for me? Not, is this going to make him happy? Is this going to make him go away? Is this going to make the kids happy? Is this going to be best for the kids? I hear that all the time, but it's best for my kids. Well, what's best for your kids doesn't mean it's best for you. So when you're doing things for other people, you're putting a pretty crappy version of yourself out there. So pause, just take a beat. You do not have to instantly reply. Nobody said that you have to. I give myself like a 24-hour rule with my ex-husband, especially because there are triggers still. And I need a second to check in with myself and go, hang on, does this work for me? And there have been many times where I have said no because it doesn't align. Do my kids know that I said no? No, because he's not going to be stupid enough to tell them, right? He doesn't tell them. And so I invite you guys to just stop getting into story,
Mm.
right? We get into story. And so it's the power in the pause, and it's that check-in with yourself. It is about you making sure, right? Does this honor? Another thing that I invite my clients to do is think about the relationships that you have in your life and times where you have had your boundaries stepped on, or you know that there are certain asks that are constantly being put upon you, or you're allowing to be put upon you,
Mm.
and come up with one-liner scripts, right? That you practice. You have to, in order to strengthen your boundary, you can't just think them. You have to speak them out loud. I actually, one of the exercises I do with my clients is we work on that language together,
Mm-hmm.
and they have to verbally speak it to me, or, text or voice text it to me, so that they get in the habit, because there's a difference between thinking
Sure.
what you want to say versus hearing your language come out of your mouth. And it gets easier, and it becomes a no-brainer when you start saying it out loud.
Wendy, I have to know
And
what some of those one-liners are. Can you please share with our,
no,
oh, that was a
yes.
firm boundary. Can you please share with our listeners what some of those one-liners that they can even probably steal from themselves sound like?
Yeah. So number one is no,
Mm-hmm.
literally, no, that doesn't work for me, or no, thank you. Be polite, be respectful, be kind. I'm not saying be rude or mean or disrespectful.
Sure.
We can still give kindness in our boundary setting. Another one, another one that I have used very often is, and this works for pretty much any situation. Like if you are in person or if you're on the phone, a lot of times I will use the line, interesting.
Ooh.
That's it. Interesting. Or if it's something, there have been times where my ex and I have disagreed on things, and I'll just say to him, instead of getting into
Mm.
we're so susceptible to getting into like, I'm right, right? We always want to be right. And so we get into this like tug of war verbal altercation where you just want the other person to hear you. And so what I have stopped doing is that. And instead, what I do is, well, I guess we're just going to have to agree to disagree.
I guess we're going to have
What
to
are they
agree
going
to
to
disagree.
say?
Yeah.
Because clearly you don't agree. What's the other person going to say? Let them say I'm right. And the biggest tip that I will give your audience is stop trying to reinvent the wheel every time the same boundary is not being honored.
Oh,
Why are
wait, that
you
sounds good.
reinventing the wheel?
Yes, that
Rinse and
sounds
repeat
good.
is what I call it.
So you don't need to come up with a new one-liner. You don't need to say anything different. You can go back to your chosen phrase and the same way that they're coming back to their chosen request. You don't have to keep jumping through
Exactly.
hoops.
Right. And the only reason we do is because we're like, oh, are they not hearing us? So we think, well, let me try it differently. Nope. They just don't like what you're saying. It's not that they don't hear you, they don't like it.
That's so true.
Rinse and repeat. And
So
sometimes
true.
it's going to take 7, 8 times. There was something that came up with me and my ex-husband. It was last summer, and we were on vacation, and he just kept hounding me about something. And I literally wrote him back and I said, no. And then he kept coming at me and I said, no, that doesn't work for me. And then he came at me again. And I wrote him back and said, I have said no now 3 times. My answer is still no.
Mm.
And he finally backed off. Now, this was a year ago, and we have been separated for 6 years.
Mm.
Okay. So 5 years later, I'm still having to repeat myself 3 times to him about certain things. So don't give up just because you don't get the right answer the first time. Just stand in your power of the language that you used the first time.
Beautiful.
They don't like what you're saying. It's not that they don't hear you. So stop trying to reinvent the wheel. You're exhausting yourself for no reason. Let them be the one exhausted.
I love it. I love it. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much, Wendy. This advice has been pure gold and is going to definitely help people who are listening to the sound of your voice today start to make those very strong, impenetrable boundaries in their life that is going to bring them more joy, bring them more time, bring them more happiness, bring them closer relationships, all of the beautiful things that they want. Now, I'm a fan of one hit wonders. So if there is one thing that you want people to do after listening to you today, and hearing about building unbreakable boundaries, what is that one action step you hope everybody within the sound of your voice right now will take?
So what's coming to me is a quote that I use very often, and it applies to boundaries. And that is, other people's opinions of your words are none of your business.
Mm.
Stand in your power of what feels authentic for you, and stop worrying about what other people think of you, because what that does is it gives them power and you're giving it to them. So stand in and keep your power by not listening to their opinion about words.
Yes, I love that. Let's not weaken those boundaries as you were talking about by worrying about what other people will say. Stand in your power, ladies. I love that. All right, Wendy, please. I know that people will want to engage with you more. I know that our listeners are loving all the gems that you shared with us today. Where are you most active on social media so they know where to find you? And I hear that you might have like a little gift for them as well, a little free gift.
Yes. So, well, first of all, I have my own podcast. So I would love for you guys to continue listening, the Divorced Woman's Guide podcast. And I also am across social media, predominantly Facebook and Instagram. And my handle is Divorce Rehab with Wendy. So those are the best places. I'm new to TikTok. So I don't know if any of your listeners go there or not, but I'm playing with it and it's kind of fun.
Awesome. Awesome.
Oh, and the free gift. So, I have a free downloadable of 5 steps that your listeners can start taking to start setting other boundaries for yourself in your life today. So there is a link for you guys to get a hold of that download, and you all get to become boundary setting queens just like me.
I love it. All right. So I'm ecstatic that everybody took a couple of steps while listening to becoming a boundary setting queen. I hope they get that free downloadable so they can take the next steps and keep practicing, keep practicing, keep practicing. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Wendy. It has been an
Thank
absolute
you.
pleasure.
Thank you. The same here. It's been an honor.
All right. Take care. Talk to you soon.
Bye.
Thank you so much for listening to today's show. Your support means so much to us, and I hope you got some great value from today's episode. If you're looking for resources from today's show, or you'd like to join other women just like you, looking to explore their sexual health and wellness, visit us over at scarletsociety.com.